earlier, we before we got on camera, or before we started the Facebook feed, one thing that we talked about was Sean's life, taking a big change this year with officership, and I wonder if you could speak about that from just reflecting on what we've been talking about, vocation and about occupation and all that. Can you give us some insight into your soul on that whole matter?
Yeah. So, like I said, it was very unexpected. But yeah, for me, just thinking about like in my work, right? Like, I feel like I do a pretty good job of like my coworkers knowing that, I'm a Christian. I go to the Salvation Army. They might ask me, hey, what are you doing today or this weekend? And I'll say, oh, hey, today I'm helping out with Adventure Corps. So just tell them a little bit about what we're doing. Or maybe they might say, hey, what are you doing this weekend? I'm doing a seminar. So just tell them a little bit about the seminar. Maybe there's one point where I had some of the seminar materials with me. And so I shared that with a coworker. So did that. Yeah, so the candidate seminar, right? That came around. And like for a long time, like way before the seminar happened, I've been praying to God, like what my purpose is, like what can I do to further the kingdom? So kind of my question for myself is being in the bank, is that the best place for me to do that? Or should I do that somewhere else? So I wasn't really 100% on like what my path should be for my life. And during that time at the seminar, I kind of, was having a good time, meeting new people, finding out about officership. And even before the seminar, like people would ask me, or they would say, hey, you'd be a good officer in the Army. And then kind of me feeling like, you don't have to be an officer or a minister to, like do ministry to share the word. And then there's like my own personal things like, oh, hey, I don't think I'm going to be a minister because, I got a job I like. It's not for me. And so, I had my reasons for not wanting to, go full time in the ministry.
And the world needs bankers too, right?
Yeah.
And so someone's got to do that.
Yeah. So I think too, like you can take like your occupational work and then use that to further the ministry too. So like for me, like banking, and I studied accounting. So for me, like those are things that I can take to the Army and use those in my ministry to help the mission of spreading the word.
Thank you, Sean. I wonder if there are others who might share ways that they have really found themselves living out their faith and 100% living out their job as well. So that the boundary or break, is between those disappears.
I think for me, because I kind of stumbled into youth ministry very interestingly, I was going to another church, and someone actually at core needed someone to kind of fill in for Sunday school as a Sunday school teacher, and she was leaving for several months, and she asked me if I could do it, so I did. And I was in my last semester of college, kind of thinking about law school, and kind of pursuing that and on that trajectory. And the kids in my Sunday school class started a petition for me to be the youth pastor. Now, they hadn't really had to have a youth pastor in a long time, for years. And the corps officer came to me and goes, so, hey, there's this petition. Do you want to be a youth pastor? And that was like my introduction to youth ministry. I never thought I was ever going to be a youth pastor. And I say that in kind of connection to your question. I think those first years of youth ministry where I had no idea, I just knew that God had a call. He called me to a radically different life than what I was living. And it wasn't a bad road. It was a very different road. But I remember just kind of doing almost like those baby steps. You kind of know that there's no you kind of act as though there's no boundaries. It's not jaded with anything or experiences. You're kind of like, I didn't know this was a rule. I'm just going to go.
It just flows. Yeah.
It just flows. And reflecting now back at 12 years ago, because that was 12 years ago, I think that was like one of the best kind of juxtaposition between vocation, and it just kind of fluidly in my life and my work and my vocation, and all of it just worked because I didn't actually know where the boundaries laid. So I kind of just walked through very freely, very openly. And I think as I went along, there was kind of this, okay, this is how you do youth ministry. And especially because I was very gray, because this wasn't the job path that I was going to do, the vocation I was going to do, or how I was going to enter the world for Christ. I was like, oh, this is how you do it. But I remember those years as being free and no boundaries. And I think that's part of where I really learned how to kind of learn, because it was just no boundaries. But that's for me. I try to like always go back to that space, because I think a lot of times when you're walking out your vocation, you could kind of get into certain ruts in some ways, or some certain patterns. Not always, but I think I go back to that time and be like, okay, it was free. Christ made us free to do this. He called us to this, to spread the gospel. There's a freeing to that. So that's just me personally.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah. Any other experiences along those lines of just finding just a real expression of your faith within an occupation?
So, like I said, my brother is severely disabled, and it's always been a struggle for me to find the right balance between trying to help take care of him and also feeling like I'm being, authentic to whatever my calling is. And I think I've come over the years to realize that those two things are not separate, and that, to be a good brother, to be a good friend, to be a good caregiver is a deeply faithful act. And it's hard. It's very, this is not easy work. There are a lot of people who do this work, and it's overlooked by a lot of different people. And I think that it requires a certain faithfulness that is difficult for me. It's challenging, because it'd be a lot easier to try to get a job doing something else or work in a church or something like that. As difficult as that is, like, it would be a lot easier at times than to take care of someone like my brother. That's extremely challenging work. So it has been a long journey for sure, and I don't want to gloss over that and to make it sound like, oh, well, everything's fine now, because it's not. It's an ongoing struggle and challenge to make sense of, and in some ways, like, and I think this is why I interpret it in terms of a call or a vocation, is because I have no control over it. Like, I'm his brother. I didn't get to choose that. He didn't get to choose to be born disabled, and I didn't get to choose to be his brother. So in some ways, like, it's out of my hands. I have nothing to do with it. And there's a certain responsibility and duty that I have to him, to be faithful to him and to take care of him. And that is probably the most faithful thing, worshipful thing that I can do, despite my struggles with, understanding that role, understanding how it fits in, and all those different things. So I think that, it's an ongoing struggle, but it's as close as I have to something that is that intersection between, vocation and occupation.
Well, sorry.
I was going to say, you made me think of my grandparents were officers, and I actually was able to take care of them in their last years to some extent, and so I had a lot of time to sit with them and stuff like that. And I remember, at one point or another, it came up. I'd be like, "Oh yeah, so why'd you guys get into ministry? Why'd you guys become officers?" Because they became officers at like 19, which I'm not sure is whatever the best, but it works sometimes. But I remember her saying, well, she's like, I wasn't really called necessarily. She just said, we were involved at the Corps and there were needs. So she had this kind of like a motto, or maybe it's a maxim, I don't know what you call it, but like the need is the call.
Yeah.
The need is the cause. And I think, and I like that. I mean, it took me a while to kind of think it through, but I think we all sort of have a call to, if we are Christians, we call ourselves Christians, we have a call to be responsive to needs. We have a call to responsibility of one kind or another. And that can take all kinds of shapes, so that responsiveness, that responsibility, kind of, you bring that with you into any sort of like workplace or whatever. So I don't want, in saying that, I don't want to like flatten out the idea of vocation into like, oh, everything is, because I think there are sort of, circumstances where people really are called and they hear God and stuff like that. And I don't want to poo-poo that or whatever. But yeah, I think there's different ways to think about it.
And Matt, I wonder how much of that that kind of expression, like the need is the call, is a cultural thing, a generational thing, even because it seems like, to understand that if you're not meeting some kind of a need, then where is the call? I think there's some legitimacy and maybe even an escape from the individualistic thing. And we're probably not going to be able to get there because I want to honor the time. So we're gonna wrap up, and I'm going to ask each of you for a last maybe brief statement. But one place that we didn't go that we could go was the cultural aspect, where on a couple of occasions in both of those clips, Marlon talked about on the one hand, this is a concern for American Christians, and you can't even ask the question on the same terms in other countries and other contexts. And then he brought explicitly out with his friend from father figure from Kenya, who really addressed him in a dramatic way. And I do wonder how different generations and how different cultures need to explore this, and maybe we're just being like uber concerned, with kind of American individualism and so forth.
Yeah.
And that testimony from Matt's grandparents is something that really speaks into this culture and our world today. So yeah, think about what would you like to say to close up? I did appreciate. We just want to acknowledge what Nathan said about the fact that it's ongoing, that we don't stop wrestling with this, we don't settle it, and maybe the unsettledness is part of the part of life, part of blood flowing through our veins and so forth. Who would like to volunteer to?
I think especially seeing as you were just talking about different cultural perspectives. I'm originally from South Africa, and so I actually wrote down that I thought Marlon presented a very American perspective, which is totally fine, because that's where that's his perspective, that's his view. I come with a very different perspective, having lived through apartheid South Africa, being a part of the change that came to that country, and so I've got a very different perspective, not just of the church, but of the Salvation Army even in that country. But the one thing I would say that just, for my wrap-up words is that all of that, regardless of our culture, for me, as I was reading Romans 12, and I've referred to it earlier, it just kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of everything that we're talking about. The writer of Romans starts out with offering your life as a living sacrifice, and then goes into the fact that we are all called to do something individually, but as part of the body, and that our job is to play that part. I think that's part of discovering your vocation. But then he says, your love must be real. And then goes on from verse 17 to talk about putting our love into action, doing something about it. And I think for me, that sums up our entire conversation. It sums up what Marlon was trying to say, that's really what it's all about. Discovering what God's called you to do, and then doing it so that God can be glorified and people can be won for the kingdom.
Thank you. Who's next?
Okay, I'll go. So, I wasn't sure how long this conversation was ago, and I was trying to I took a bunch of notes. I'm like trying to space everything out. So okay, I don't want to get to something too soon and then have nothing to say. So I want to take this brief time to reflect on people like my brother and their vocation, because I think that it's really easy to think about what it's like for me to have a vocation and a calling. But when I think about somebody like my brother, who he can't speak, he can't take care of himself, he can't use the bathroom by himself, he can't feed himself, he can't walk without assistance. Like, what does it mean for him to have a calling? What does it mean for him to have a vocation? And if I personally, and this is just my personal belief, if it doesn't make sense for him, then it doesn't make sense for anyone. Like if what I'm saying a vocation and a calling can't make sense to someone like my brother, if he can't have a vocation, then it doesn't make sense for any of us. And I want to, in that spirit, sort of point people to somebody who I've really started to look up to. I've never met him, but just from his work, Jean Vanier. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. He started an organization called L'Arche, which is French for the Ark. It's a international community. People with intellectual disabilities, they live together with their caregivers. So they have these little homes all over the world, and just buy houses and live together with their caregivers. And I think that is a beautiful model for vocation, because it's more about friendship, I think, than it is about anything else, right? Like the people who are receiving the care, they're called core members. And the people who are giving the care are called assistants. And it's really the people with disabilities that are at the center of those communities. And it's so much about relationality, getting to know each other, becoming friends, that almost vocation seems like it doesn't even come up. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't even make sense to think about it in terms of vocation, because we are living in relationship with one another, so that our duty and responsibility is to each other. Our calling is to be in community with another, to help one another, to support one another, to love one another. And I think that it would behoove everyone to look into his work and to even spend some time with people in that community, because it radically alters and shifts our understanding of what vocation means, what calling means, when you meet someone who literally can't work, who can't have a job in any way, shape, or form. Like, it doesn't make sense to talk about my brother having a job and bringing his calling. It just doesn't make any sense. So, when we reflect about these things, we need to keep in mind that there are a lot of people that are very, very different from us, and that if it doesn't make sense for them, then maybe we need to rethink our whole framework for how we understand these things. But this has been fun. I've really learned a lot from everyone, so I'm glad you guys have included me in this. I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much. And who's next?
I'll jump in. We sort of started with pointing out a possible flaw in his thinking about maybe he's coming from this from a vantage that's too individualistic, too modern. Maybe it's like, he's talking about self-actualization and that sort of thing, and you can hear in the background the pursuit of happiness and blah blah blah. But I think that even while we want to be critical of that, I don't think that we want to kind of get rid of the individual. I think that there is a way to straddle the individual and the communal in a way that's beneficial, in a way that's fruitful. It's not doesn't set up a false dichotomy, because we're always, as individuals, we are individuals in relation, as Nate was just saying. I almost called Nathaniel. I'm sorry. But I think that this understanding of desire and one's passion, bringing that in to the expression of one's faith, I think is important, because we need those. We need passion. We need desire. And we need agape, stuff like that. But we need a little eros too, And I think that service that doesn't take into account one's own passions and desires isn't ultimately sustainable, and leads to all kinds of neuroses and stuff like that. But anyway, and from a lay leadership perspective, I think that all of this has implications that for local mission, for local leadership development, that we have yet to sort of think through. So I like this conversation. I want to keep it going. So maybe we can do this again. I don't know. That's all I have.
Well, thank you. Now, Sean, you're the only one left. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm thinking about just there's that component of needing, that relationship with others. And then, you gotta feel like having like those words of affirmation from others. That's good to hear, like about your calling, but also making it about between like yourself and God. And so just, making sure you set that time aside to, ask God, like, hey, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Just trying to be attentive to what he is kind of leading us to, kind of thinking about that. And just when you do receive an answer about, what you're supposed to do, I would encourage you all to, act on that, right? Because then you don't want to miss out on that opportunity. You don't want to miss out on that blessing that you can have to experience your calling. So just think about making it between you and God, and just being obedient.
Yeah. And you mentioned the divine and the human aspect of it. I know a person who was ordained online. I don't know if you ever heard of that happening. It used to be that you had to go to the back of the Inquirer magazine in order to get ordained, but by means of correspondence. But he's actually ordained online, and it just occurs to me that to self-designate, I am an ordained minister, and whatever that means, seems like it's lacking. It might have that divine, you might have this conscience about it, but when you say to hear other people's affirmations, people from your community that say, yeah, I agree, this is your calling. In the Bible, in the New Testament, sometimes they talk about laying on of hands, and Paul encourages Timothy to say, don't forget, people laid their hands on you, and don't forget these prophecies that people spoke. It's something. But at the end of this conversation, I just want to say thank you to each of you taking time with no remuneration. We talked about remuneration. Nobody paid you a dime. Nobody paid you anything. I hope it was a value to you in your life, but you have added value to me. Certainly, this conversation has been rich for me. I failed to mention earlier, but I do want to honor this, that actually Nathaniel Welsh also works with the Homebrewed Christianity podcast with Trip Fuller. And I just wanted to honor, that's another place that he dips his, lends his hand and so forth. But thank you each for being here.
All right, guys. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks very much.
Yes,
All right,
it
talk
was.
to you guys.
Thanks, everyone. Great meeting you.
Bye.
Good to see each of you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.